With the release of Origins, Dynasty Warriors has had a resurgence, and even gained praise from those who were previously critical of the franchise. This was mainly thanks to the overall combat system, so it was more involved and skill based, but they also attempted to bring back some of the tactical focus of the older games. With that said, as someone who has been there since Dynasty Warriors 3, I've spent nearly 25 years playing and pondering the design side of these games, so I have my own thoughts on how the current gameplay formula in Origins could be improved going forward. And just a heads up that this is a long one, so put down the halberd, make a cup of tea, relax, and let me ramble at you for a while. This video is going to be separated into two sections, the first being improvements that I think can be made to the mainline Dynasty Warriors series going forward from Origins, and the second section of changes that might be better off in a new spin-off title, similar to what they did with Empires when trying new things, or even a whole new IP like what they did with Samurai Warriors. This is because while the second section includes changes that I'd like to see in Dynasty Warriors and think could lead to a larger player base, it wouldn't want to remove the current formula that existing fans enjoy. So for clarity, the first section has changes that I think would safely improve the current gameplay formula for all, and the second section has more fundamental changes that might be better off in a new title. Note that I won't be discussing obvious, surface level changes that many fans would like, such as bring back the large roster. This video is about more specific, mechanical changes and improvements. So let's dive in. The first change I'd like to see to the current formula is to bring back individual officer morale and merge it with courage. Longtime fans of the series will remember when officers in the older titles had individual morale ratings, which could rise and fall dynamically depending on what's happening on the battlefield. I have another video which went into detail about this, so if you're not familiar with how morale worked in the older games, then I highly recommend checking it out. But in a nutshell, officers' KO counts, defeating other officers, losing troops, and losing lieutenants would all contribute to an officer's individual morale rating rising and falling as the battle progressed. This individual morale rating would then greatly impact the off-screen battle performance for that officer and any lieutenant officers and troops fighting under their command. Dynasty Warriors 6 was the last game to have individual morale ratings, as 7 and 8 stripped back and simplified how morale and the battle simulation in general worked, as they focused on the 1 vs 1000 gameplay instead. And then came along Origins, which attempted to turn back the clock and revive the tactical battle simulation aspect of the older games that had been lost as the series progressed. And while it generally achieved that, morale has been left in an odd halfway house situation, where it sits somewhere between the individual officer morale of the older games and the unified force morale of the later games. Let me explain this in more detail. So instead of bringing back the individual officer morale of the PS2 era games, Origins introduced a new mechanic called Courage. But that's just morale with a new name, right? I hear you ask. Well, no, it isn't. Morale and Courage do work together, but they're actually separate mechanics with their own functions. Force morale impacts off-screen performance of allies and enemies and will rise and fall as officers are defeated and bases are lost or gained, while the Courage increases the aggression level and the battle performance of officers both off-screen and on-screen. High Courage officers are buffed and attack more frequently, while negative Courage officers have notably lowered stats, which is why they can be defeated very quickly while in that state. Sounds good, right? It is. Certainly better than 7, 8 and 9, but the problem with Courage is that it's largely static. Unlike morale, it doesn't frequently rise and fall outside of a few specific triggers, and the dynamic triggers only cause short, temporary changes. So there's 5 main ways that Courage will change in Origins. Scripted stage events. These are by far the most impactful, as these can create permanent baseline changes to an officer's courage level. Large force charges can raise ally courage, and enemy large forces breaking can reduce enemy courage. but making this a separate point from point 1 is somewhat generous, as these themselves are scripted events, as large forces only happen at pre-placed points of specific stages. Using bodyguard tactics can lower an enemy officer's courage for a short period of time. Enemy grand tactics failing can lower enemy courage for a short period of time. Using War God Rage mode can raise the courage of some allies for a short period of time. Of these, the scripted stage events have by far the biggest impact, as it's the only one that makes courage changes that actually last. Not all stages have large forces charging and grand tactics, and when they do, they normally only happen at the very end of a stage. And the dynamic changes, such as the courage decrease from the player using successful bodyguard tactics, are infrequent and only last for a short period of time. This creates a situation where courage is quite static compared to morale, as while morale will rise and fall as you defeat officers and capture or lose bases, none of that changes the courage level of officers, and the impact of courage is very strong, so this can lead to very contradictory situations where your army's morale can be high and mostly blue, but your allies will still get their butts kicked by enemy officers with high courage. I believe Omega Force designed it this way on purpose as a form of artificial difficulty, as it means that no matter how much you raise your side's morale, there's normally always going to be certain enemy officers that you personally have to go and deal with, or your allies will struggle. It's a design philosophy that I disagree with, but I'll have more to say on this later in the video. So what would I do? Well, to loop back to the statement made at the start of the section, I'd bring back individual officer morale ratings and merge the effect of courage into it. This means that morale would no longer just affect off-screen battles, but would also increase or decrease the aggression and stats of officers and troops while on screen, depending on the morale rating. The biggest change this merger would create is that those existing courage effects would now be much more dynamic, rising and falling along with morale, instead of being largely static with just short temporary changes like in Origins. So now that morale and courage have been merged, the second change would be to bring back the factors that altered morale in the older games that were lost in the later games. For example, up until Dynasty Wars 5, officers could get a morale boost upon getting 50 KOs, and you'd see an announcement about their achievements, but this was removed in Dynasty Warriors 6 and wasn't brought back in Origins. I think this was a mistake. I think Origins officers' KO counts should have boosted their courage level, and losing troops under their control should have reduced the courage. So now that in my hypothetical future morale and courage have been merged, I think factors like these should be brought back to make the battle simulation more dynamic. 3. Bring back the starting morale random factor. In the older games, there used to be a small random factor applied to the starting morale of enemy officers. It could be a star higher or lower at the start of the stage, and this could then have knock-on effects on the battlefield. I think this should be brought back and slightly expanded so it applies to the starting morale of allies as well, as this will make stages a bit less predictable in terms of how they play out, and thus improve the replayability of the game. 4. Bring back lieutenants. In the older games, officers could have other named officers fighting under their command as lieutenants. This created tactical battlefield choices, as defeating lieutenants could reduce the morale of the lead officer, or defeating the lead officer would make any lieutenants under their command retreat from the battlefield. I don't see any downside to bringing this back to the gameplay formula. In my opinion, it was a mistake to remove it. It was a completely unnecessary simplification that took root from Dynasty Wars 7 onwards. 5. Bring back officer troop counts. Each officer used to have a certain number of troops under their control, with reinforcements arriving via checkpoints. Again, this finite troop count was something that was removed from the formula starting with Dynasty Wars 7. It's a fairly minor factor overall, as officers would normally be defeated before running out of reinforcements. But with other simulation factors like individual officer morale and lieutenants being brought back, then there's no harm with finite troop counts being brought back as well as something else for the player to consider on the battlefield. 6. Bring back the Dynasty Wars 3 and 4 bodyguard system, but keep the Origins bodyguards as troops. The bodyguard system has taken different forms in the series, but by far the fan favourite is the version found in Dynasty Wars 3 and 4. In those games you could get up to 8 bodyguards who would rank up and could be customised with different weapons, and once maxed out they'd become absolute murder machines on the battlefield. In Origins we can get up to 50 bodyguards who follow us around and can use tactics, which is great. But it feels less involved, as you can't customise them beyond which tactics to use, and you can't alter their weapons, their looks, and you don't rank them up like you do with the bodyguards in Dynasty Wars 3 and 4. So if I was in charge, I'd give the player both. I say give the player back the 8 personal bodyguards that we can level up and customise, and let these become an ace squad of fighters like in the old games. And then the 50 bodyguards in Origins, keep them exactly as they are, including the tactics, but just call them something else. They can be simply referred to as our personal troops that follow the player around the battlefield. 7. Make troop types and ranks matter. From Dynasty Wars 6 onwards, including Origins, troop ranks and their types barely matter at all, with their differences being largely just visual. This wasn't always the case, as in the likes of Dynasty Wars 3, there was a noticeable difference in battle performance of troop ranks such as Private and Majors, but even then, it wasn't a huge consideration for the player in terms of how they approach a fight. I think they should be completely overhauled, so troop types such as swordsmen, spearmen, halberdiers, or troops with shields all have different strengths that are different enough to actually impact the gameplay. These differences should be strong enough to make the player consider how they approach these troop types, and then the troops' ranks should notably impact their aggression and stats. I guarantee most of you watching this right now pay next to no attention to the troop types when you play Origins, as they're basically just blades of grass for you to mow down. These two improvements, making troop types and ranks matter, would change that and add another layer of depth to the battlefield. 8. Slow down the stage pacing. The battles in Origins feel like they play out at a breakneck pace, with the player having to zigzag across the battlefield as quickly as they can to save their crying allies from the jaws of defeat. At first thought, this fast-paced playout of stages might seem like a good thing, as it adds urgency to the player's actions, and I do acknowledge that, but overall, I actually think it's a slight negative for the experience as a whole. Let me explain. The battlefields in Origins are by far the best they've ever been. The sheer number of troops on screen, the improved visuals, animations and combat mechanics mean that the large battles have never looked or felt this good. And yet, there's no time to actually take it all in. There's no time to just breathe and absorb this excellent battlefield atmosphere that the developers have created. Because your side's victory entirely depends on you, the player, doing everything as quickly as you can. So I do think on the whole it would be better to slow down the pace the stage plays out at, so it's a bit more like the older titles where you progress alongside your allies. This would help ground the player within the battlefields a bit more, so they can take in its atmosphere instead of just running blindly from point A to B to C as quickly as they can. This neatly leads into the next change I'd like to see, as the main way of reducing the player's need to zigzag across the battlefield is to 9. Reduce the need to babysit allies. Throughout the franchise, to force a level of challenge upon the player, the developers have relied upon making your allies weak, outnumbered and constantly shouting for help. I've previously covered this in a video about artificial difficulty in games of different genres, so feel free to check that out. but it's a very important point to make clear, so we do need to cover it again here. So as I said in the video about artificial difficulty, in most Dynasty Warriors stages, no matter which side of the battle you're on, things are always flipped so that your army is weaker and your allies' frequent cries for help make these battles 50% fighting, 50% babysitting simulator. So instead of the actual combat being difficult, the challenge is in the player having to quickly zigzag across the battlefield from A to B to save an ally before they die, and then from B to C to the next struggling ally before they die, and so on. This is a clear design choice by the developers, and you might recall earlier in the video during the morale section I mentioned disagreeing with this design philosophy. In my opinion, this forced babysitting is a poor way of adding challenge to the gameplay for multiple reasons, as from the player's perspective it feels quite forced, annoying, or even immersion breaking. A common counter-argument given by some fans who defend the babysitting aspect is, well, if they made your allies competent, then the game would be too easy. That's a logical point to make, but it's short-sighted, as it assumes no other changes would be made to increase the difficulty in other ways. For example, the actual fighting could be made more challenging and deadly to achieve difficulty that way, and other changes that I've already mentioned in this video, such as making troop types and ranks matter, would really play into this. The existence of Mount and Blade shows that you can absolutely have challenging battles without artificially making things more difficult for the player's side in the way that Dynasty Warriors does. And as for the babysitting hurting immersion, for a game that's trying to depict two large armies clashing, to always flip the side's strength on the stage so that the player's army is weak, that can take you out of it and stops it from feeling like a real battle between two forces. Longtime fans of the series will know that this has been one of the most common complaints about the games from the very beginning, and yet it's something that has actually got generally worse as the series progressed. I find it hard to believe that Koei aren't aware of the babysitting being an unpopular part of the gameplay, but for whatever reason they've simply ignored the complaints and stuck with it, sadly even in Origins. I strongly think this needs to finally be nipped in the bud, so if I was in charge, this babysitting design philosophy would be removed from the gameplay formula, and instead the challenge would be achieved in other ways, such as more challenging combat, as I already mentioned. To be very clear, this doesn't mean that your allies should always be safe and should never struggle. No, far from it. It just means that making your armies small and weak would no longer be a purposefully implemented design choice for every stage, so that the gameplay focus is on the actual fighting and tactical battlefield choices, instead of zigzagging around quickly to save multiple struggling allies. In some stages it might make logical sense for your side to start off on the back foot, and that's perfectly fine. The point is that it should make sense and be stage dependent, instead of being a core aspect of every stage's design. So that's it for the first section. 9 changes that I think would safely improve the current formula without alienating existing fans. This was longer than I expected, so let's do a quick recap of those 9 points. Bring back individual officer morale and merge it with courage. Bring back the factors that altered morale in the older games that were lost in the later games. Bring back the starting morale random factor. Bring back lieutenants. Bring back officer troop counts, bring back the Dynasty Warriors 3 and 4 bodyguard system, but keep the Origins bodyguards as troops, make troop types and ranks matter, slow down the stage pacing, and reduce the need to babysit allies. So next up is the second section, and as I mentioned at the start, these changes are more fundamental, so they might be more appropriate for a spin-off title or new IP within the Musou genre. 1. Make battles more dynamic like in Empires. Besides the player's actions and morale, the biggest factor to how stages in the mainline Dynasty Warriors games play out is the predetermined route that each officer follows. Each officer has their stage route planned out as a series of checkpoints that they're scripted to follow, so they'll engage enemy officers and troops in front of them, and then if they're victorious, they'll continue to the next pre-planned engagement with another base or officers and their troops, normally as they progress towards the enemy main camp. These predetermined routes are done for all officers on the stage, and it's been like that since Dynasty Warriors 2, all the way up to Origins. In the Empire's games, however, there's no predetermined routes, and instead the battles are more dynamic, with officers making decisions to attack or defend based on which forts each side controls, how they're doing personally, or the player can give them direct commands. Personally, I can imagine this more dynamic nature being merged into the mainline series, but I'd understand if some would rather it stayed in separate spin-offs. Now, to be fair to Omega Force, they did seem to consider this kind of dynamic AI behaviour within the experimental Dynasty Warriors 6, but it's a very basic implementation that didn't have much impact on the battles, and I'm going to guess a lot of players simply didn't even notice it. So for the sake of theory crafting, I'll describe how I envisage it being merged into the mainline series going forward, since they've never tried it again, including in Origins despite it being more tactical. I think this dynamic behaviour can be added while also keeping the predetermined officer routes so that it's a merger, not a replacement. So while officers would still have predetermined routes to follow, just like in all the other mainline games, I propose merging in and expanding the dynamic nature of the Empire's AI so that they can temporarily diverge from their predetermined routes, and then return to it once done with their dynamic goal or once a certain amount of time has passed. For example, AI officers could retreat to reinforce a base that's under attack, or they could move to help a nearby ally in trouble before returning to their own pre-planned routes. It would just need to be balanced so that it wasn't constantly happening, or the pre-planned routes would be rendered largely meaningless, but I'm absolutely confident that it could be successfully done, leading to much more dynamic battlefields, with greater variation in terms of how they play out. 2. Take a more immersive approach. This would most certainly be better off in a spin-off, as it would be a more fundamental change to the player's experience, and I wouldn't want to deprive those who already enjoy the current gameplay formula. So obviously the current Dynasty Warriors gameplay is very arcadey, with the player being a demigod in all but name. You're capable of taking on entire armies on your own without ever having to take a breather, and you can move and attack in ways that simply defies the laws of physics. But what if we went in the opposite direction, and took a step down a more grounded, immersive focused path? If we went to the opposite end of the spectrum, we'd end up with something along the lines of Bannerlord, which is a great game in its own right, and last I checked it had sold really well, so there's clearly a big potential player base for this kind of more realism focused wargame. However, I don't envisage an immersion focused Dynasty Wars going that far. If we imagine a scale with Origins on one side and Bannerlord on the other, I can imagine an immersion focused Dynasty Wars spin-off sitting somewhere in between the two. So instead of being a demigod ending a battle with 1000 to 2000 KOs in 15 minutes, you'd just be a very strong warrior, ending battles with 100 to 200 KOs, despite there being just as many enemy troops as in Origins, or preferably even more. Now your first thoughts might be that this lower KO count doesn't sound as fun because bigger numbers are better, right? But think about it. How many of those 2000 KOs in Origins actually mattered? How many of them did you actually pay any attention to while fighting? The honest, truthful answer is that, outside of the enemy officers, hardly any of the KOs in Origins actually matter. Outside of capturing bases, most of your KOs are just excess casualties while battling officers in large crowds. Most enemy troops are little more than the number being racked up as you cut them down like blades of grass. So in a more immersion focused Dynasty Warriors style game, instead I can picture gameplay where the troop KOs actually matter, every single one of them. Each of these 100 to 200 KOs would require a much higher level of engagement compared to Origins, so getting the KOs actually means something, instead of just being a number ticking up. This could be achieved by modifying existing factors so it's still ultimately the Dynasty Warriors formula, just pushed enough in a different direction to create a more immersive experience. For example, 1. Combat could be made more dangerous by buffing the normal troops so that they're better at defending, have more powerful attacks, and are more aggressive. This way the player would have to think twice before running in head first as a one-man army. 2. Movement, both in terms of the player's movement and attack animations, could be made a bit more grounded. This could be achieved by generally slowing things down, and importantly, by adding weight to how movement and combat feels. To be clear, I don't think it should go full realism, I imagine it keeping a certain cinematic flair to how it feels, just not full-on anime like we have in Origins. 3. Troops could move and fight in actual formations, like we see in the Total War franchise or Mount & Blade. And to be fair to Origins, they did seem to consider this, but it's largely superficial. For example, enemy troops tend to be in a large formation for the final showdown at the end of a stage, and might even have shield wall troops. But these formations instantly dissolve and become mosh pits the second contact is made between the two forces. So in other words, they're really just visual and have little impact on the actual gameplay. This can be changed so that formations actually matter, with troops fighting differently depending on what their formation type is. And these formations could be tied to the commanding officer's AI, so they can dynamically change their formation type based on what's happening on the battlefield. And this final suggestion would definitely require a whole new IP, because it's 2. 3. Use a medieval European setting. With Dynasty Warriors and Samurai Warriors, the games have obviously been based on the history of the Eastern world, but the director of Origins made it very clear in interviews and statements that he really wants to appeal more to Western gamers, so it's a little odd that they've never actually tried to make a Dynasty Warriors IP set in medieval Europe. And no, this one doesn't count, because it wasn't made by Omega Force, and just like Dynasty Warriors 9, it doesn't exist, okay? Okay, glad we're on the same page here. They did release Bladestorm, which is set during the 100 Years' War, but it's a different kind of game than Dynasty Warriors, so it's not applicable either. So in other words, in 25 years, Omega Force have never attempted to take Dynasty Warriors and set it within medieval Europe. If they really want to appeal to Western gamers, then the only other setting that would have an even bigger appeal would be a Lord of the Rings Dynasty Warriors adaptation. But since that would require Koei to pay for the rights to use the setting, which I assume would cost a hefty fee, let's go with medieval Europe for the sake of theory crafting. So where could it be set? Well, you're going to have to forgive me, as I'm about to be unashamedly biased and say, do it right here. Right here. These islands have so much documented history, from the Roman conquest, to the Viking invasions, to the wars of independence and beyond. There's multiple eras full of warfare, meaning Omega Force wouldn't just be able to set a game here, they could get an entire franchise out of it if they really wanted to. And I think this kind of Western setting would be perfect if paired with the other potential changes in this section, like taking a more immersive approach to the gameplay. It would create an IP that at its core has all the gameplay mechanics found in Dynasty Warriors, but with each factor pushed in a more grounded direction, so that it creates a new experience that's distinct from what we currently have, topped off with a new historical setting. And that's it for the second section. 3 larger, more fundamental changes. Just to be clear, I completely understand if some of you don't find those types of changes as appealing, and that's exactly why these suggestions were split into 2 sections in the first place. While I'd hope most long-time fans of the franchise are in agreement with the first section, that second section had changes which are much more down to personal taste, so I take no offence if they're not for you. So there we have it, my thoughts on where the Dynasty Warriors formula could go from here. For many of us who have been playing these games for over 2 decades, as goofy as they are, and despite the mockery from non-fans, they've played a big role in our long adventure in the world of gaming. The series undeniably hit a slump, so it was great to see Origins drag the Dynasty Warriors name back into the mainstream in a way that we probably haven't seen since Dynasty Warriors 4. So if you've watched until now, then you know what I'd personally like to see going forward. But really, whatever direction the series formula takes from here, let's just hope it sticks around for another 25 years of button mashing. Thanks for watching.